Bolt, the dog, noticed her first. Lifted his head from the floor beside the bed, ears forward, body still. Not aggressive, just watching. The man in the bed didn't move. He was sitting upright against the wall, knees bent, both arms wrapped around them like he was bracing for something. He hadn't touched the tray of food on the side table. He hadn't spoken to anyone since admission, according to the chart. That was 31 hours ago. Own Audet paused in the doorway. She was 32 years old and had been a registered nurse at Lakeview General for 6 years. She had worked cardiac, she had worked post-op, and for the last 2 years, she had worked the behavioral health unit on the 4th floor. She had seen patients refuse food, refuse medication, refuse eye contact. She had sat with people who couldn't explain why they were crying, and people who couldn't cry at all. She thought she had a feel for silence, the different textures of it, what it meant, what it needed. But this was different. The man's name was Corporal Alain Thibodeau, according to the intake form. Retired, 47 years old. He had served 3 tours with the Canadian forces, 2 of them in Afghanistan. The admitting notes said he had been found by a neighbor in his truck, parked outside his building in Gatineau, engine running. The neighbor had known him long enough to know that wasn't right. She called 911. Thibodeau had not been cooperative with the paramedics, and he had not been cooperative with the emergency physician, and he had not been cooperative with the first 2 nurses who had tried to complete his intake assessment. The dog's name was Brûlot. The intake form listed him as a trained psychiatric service dog. Belgian Malinois, 5 years old, certified. Previous shift notes said Thibodeau had refused to release the leash to anyone, and that security had been consulted regarding the animal's presence in the unit. The unit director, a man named Mr. Faulkner, had written a single line at the bottom of the notes. Service animal status to be verified before continued access is permitted. Simone had read that line 3 times before coming to the room. Knocked on the open door frame, lightly. Not to ask permission, the door was already open, but because she thought he deserved the courtesy. Thibodeau's eyes moved to her. They were dark and very steady, and they didn't soften. Brûlot watched her too. "Oh, I'm not here to take him," she said. She didn't explain who she was. She didn't introduce herself by title. She just stepped into the room and pulled the chair from the corner and sat down near the foot of the bed, not too close, and set his chart on her lap without opening it. Old Thibodeau said nothing. "Well, you haven't eaten," she said. Still nothing. "Hey." She glanced at the tray. "The soup is probably cold now anyway." Outside in the hallway, a cart wheeled past. Someone laughed at the nursing station down the hall. The overhead lights in the room were dimmed, which Simone had done herself when she came on shift, because the previous notes said Thibodeau kept reaching toward the switch and couldn't get to it from the bed. She sat with him for 4 minutes without speaking. She knew because she watched the second hand on her watch. 4 minutes is a long time to sit in silence with a stranger. Most people can't do it. They fill the space with words because the silence feels like failure. Simone had learned to let the silence be a room of its own. Brûlot slowly lowered his head back onto his paws. He kept watching her, but his shoulders dropped a centimeter. Brûlot noticed. She saw his jaw shift. "He doesn't usually do that," he said. His voice was rough, like he hadn't used it in a while. "Do what?" "Around someone he doesn't know." Owen looked at the dog. "He's good at his job," she said. Bull looked at her for a long moment. "Yeah," he said, "he is." She came back the next morning with a bowl of water for Brûlot and a coffee for herself. And she didn't bring anything for Thibodeau because she didn't want him to feel managed. She had learned that veterans often couldn't tolerate feeling managed. It was too close to something else. Being handled, being processed, being moved through a system that had already decided what they needed without consulting them. Was in the same position. She wondered if he slept at all. "Or infantry?" she asked, sitting down. At her sideways. "How did you know?" "Sit with your back to the wall." She nodded toward the headboard. "And you repositioned the bed somehow. It's facing the door now. It wasn't yesterday." Warmth shifted behind his eyes. Not warmth exactly. More like recognition. OF2, he said, before infantry. She didn't react with the kind of impressed noise that people sometimes made, the performative awe that she had seen make veterans go quiet again. She just nodded. A long career, she said. One. Long enough. Brûlot got up and padded over to her. He didn't touch her. He stopped about a foot away and sat, alert and formal as a sentry. "Can I?" she asked, and she was asking Thibodeau, not the dog. He told her. Then he nodded, barely. She held her hand out, palm up, at Brûlot's nose level. The dog sniffed once, methodically, and then turned and went back to his spot. "Proved," Thibodeau said. "Good," she said. "I was a little nervous." Almost smiled. It didn't reach his eyes, but it was there in the corner of his mouth for a second. Third day, Mr. Faulkner called Simone into his office. He was a careful man who wore a lanyard with 3 cards clipped to it and who kept his desk very organized. He had worked in hospital administration for 20 years. He was not unkind, but he was someone who saw the unit primarily as a system of inputs and outputs, and who believed that the right form, properly completed, could resolve most problems. The service animal documentation, he said, has not been submitted in the format required by the hospital's policy. Simone waited. Patient has not cooperated with verification procedures. We've made 3 attempts. He set a folder on the desk. I understand you've established some rapport, so I'm asking you to explain to him that the animal cannot remain in the unit without verification. What does verification require? She asked. He slid the folder toward her. It was a 4-page form. It required the dog's certification documents, a letter from a licensed mental health professional, and a signed acknowledgement from the patient confirming the animal's trained tasks. Whiny, Simone looked at it. She thought about Thibodeau in his truck with the engine running. She thought about 31 hours of silence. She thought about Brûlot's head going down when she sat quietly enough. He came in without his documents, she said. He wasn't planning to be here. I understand that, Faulkner said, but policy. His certification is federally issued, she said. I looked it up. The National Service Dog Registry. His dog's registration number is on his intake form. I checked it yesterday. She held his gaze. It's valid. Linked. That may be, but the internal protocol. Mr. Faulkner, she said, and she kept her voice quiet because she wasn't trying to embarrass him. She was trying to get him to hear her. That dog is the reason he's still alive. I don't mean metaphorically. I mean that when his neighbor found him in that truck, pacing, vocalizing, pawing at the door, the paramedic report is in the file. She paused. If we remove that dog, we may be looking at a very different outcome. Faulkner was quiet for a moment. Well, I'll see what I can do, he said, to expedite the internal process. Thank you, she said. She picked up the folder and left it on his desk. She didn't take it with her. She didn't want Thibodeau to see it and know that his right to keep his dog had been reduced to a 4-page form. Ordered eating on the 4th day. Not much, half a bowl of the oatmeal, some juice. But he ate it while she was in the room, and she thought that meant something. He had begun to talk in small doses. Short sentences, long pauses. She had learned to treat the pauses like part of the conversation, not interruptions to it. She had learned this from an old nurse on her first unit, a woman named Adelaide, who had retired the year after Simone started, who had told her, "Most people are not slow. They are just being made to feel slow by someone who is uncomfortable with quiet. Don't be that person." Simone thought about Adelaide often. Thibodeau told her about his last tour. He didn't tell her the details, not the operational ones, not the things she didn't need to know, but he told her about the weight of it. The way you came back and the country was the same and you were not. The way everyone wanted the version of you that existed before you left, and you couldn't produce that person anymore because that person was gone. And you didn't know how to explain that without sounding like you were complaining, like you were asking for something. Complaining, she said. It feels like it. Not, she said. There's a difference between complaining and telling the truth about what happened to you. Looked at the window. It was raining. Quebec in November was capable of a particular kind of gray that seemed to go on forever. Water thinks I should just, he said, and then he stopped. Oh, just? He shook his head. not unwilling to say it, more like the words had dissolved before he could reach them. She has 2 kids, my grandkids. She's busy. I don't want to be a burden. Brûlot got up and walked to Thibodeau and pressed his head against his knee. Not trained behavior, or maybe it was. Either way, Thibodeau put his hand on the dog's head without looking at him. The way you touch something you trust completely. Burden, Simone said. You're a person who's been through something that most people can't imagine, and you've been trying to carry it alone for a very long time. He didn't answer, but he didn't look away either. On the 6th day, Simone arrived for her shift and found Brûlot in the hallway. Bored, she stopped. Dog was sitting outside the room, leash looped through the door handle from the inside. He was still. His eyes found her immediately, and he did not look away. Lid, she pushed the door open. Thibodeau was on the floor in the corner, knees to his chest, both hands over his ears. He was rocking very slightly. His eyes were open, but they were not seeing the room. Not call for backup first. She went to him. Didn't touch him. She knew better than to touch someone who was inside a flashback without warning. But she got down on the floor, at his level, close enough that he could see her without lifting his head. "Go," she said quietly. "It's Simone. You're at Lakeview. You're safe. Brûlot is in the hall. He's okay." The last part mattered. She had learned that on the 4th day, when he'd told her that during episodes, his first thought was always the dog. Or it took 11 minutes. Old. She timed it because she always timed it, and because she wanted to be able to write it accurately in her notes, and because timing it gave her something to do with the clinical part of her brain while the rest of her just stayed present. When he came back, and he did come back, he always came back, that was the thing she wanted him to know. His breathing slowed. He looked at her. His face was a geography of exhaustion. "I'm here," she said. "Lay." He nodded. Odd. She got up and opened the door, and Brûlot came in immediately and went to Thibodeau and pressed against him, and Thibodeau wrapped one arm around the dog and put his forehead against the top of his head and stayed there. Elsa, Simone stood by the window and gave them the room. 3 days later, Faulkner called her in again. This time there was a woman with him, someone from hospital administration named Ms. Corriveau, and a man who introduced himself as representing the Patient Safety Committee. Simone had never seen the Patient Safety Committee convened for anything that felt like it was about the patient's safety. She sat down. The concern, they said, was that the service animal verification had still not been completed in the internal format. There had been a complaint, they didn't say from whom, that the animal had been observed in the hallway unsupervised. They were concerned about liability. Simone listened to all of it. She waited until they were finished. "His registration is verified through the National Registry," she said. "I submitted that information to this office on day 4. The dog was not unsupervised. His leash was secured and I arrived within seconds. I have the time-stamped notes." She opened her folder. "I also want to note that Corporal Thibodeau has now completed 2 sessions with Dr. Bolak from psychiatry, and Dr. Bolak has documented that the service dog is an integral part of the patient's stabilization plan." She set the papers on the desk. Removing the animal at this stage would be clinically contraindicated. That's also documented. The man from the Patient Safety Committee looked at the papers, then at Corriveau, then at Faulkner. "The registration was submitted day 4, Faulkner said, more quietly than she expected. "Was," Simone said. The meeting ended. She wasn't sure she'd won anything. She wasn't sure it was the kind of thing you won. But they didn't move the dog. She called her mother that night from the parking garage, sitting in her cold car with the heater on. Mother, a retired school teacher from Trois-Rivières, who had strong opinions about most things, and who had never quite understood why Simone had chosen nursing over medicine, listened without interrupting, which was unusual. "He's going to be okay?" her mother asked. "I think so," Simone said. "I think he's going to need a lot of time and a lot of help, but I think so." "Og? And the dog?" "Og is still there." Her mother was quiet for a moment. "That dog probably knew before anyone else," she said. Simone said. "He did." On the 9th day, Thibodeau's daughter came. Her name was Lucy. She was in her late 20s with her father's eyes and an expression that was trying very hard to be composed. She sat in the chair that Simone had sat in on the first day, and she held her father's hand across the bed railing, and neither of them spoke for a while. Simone checked in twice and otherwise left them alone. She had learned that her job was not to be in the room for every important moment. It was to make the room safe enough that the important moments could happen without her. Or at the end of visiting hours, Lucy stopped her in the hallway. "Told me about you," she said. Simone waited. "Well, he said you sat with him on the first day and didn't ask him anything." She paused. "He said that was the first time in 2 years he didn't feel like a problem someone was trying to solve." Well, Simone didn't know what to say to that. She thought about Adelaide. She thought about the 4-page form still sitting on Faulkner's desk. She thought about 11 minutes on a cold floor. "Problem," she said. "He's a person." Lucy pressed her lips together. "I know that. I think I forgot for a while. I was scared and I made it about me being scared." She looked down at her hands. "I'm going to do better." "Who's that?" Simone said. "Tell him anyway." The day Thibodeau was discharged, he stood up from the bed and he was taller than she'd realized. He'd spent so many days folded into himself that she hadn't registered his full height. He shook her hand. His grip was firm and brief, the way someone shakes your hand when they mean it. Brûlot sat beside him, leash slack, watching the door. "Thank you," he said. "Well, you did the work," she said. "I mean for the other thing." He glanced away briefly. The form, the committee, whatever that was. Law, she'd thought he didn't know. You heard. Black mentioned it. He looked at her. "You didn't have to do that." "Well, yes, I did," she said. "Once." Then he picked up his bag, and Brûlot stood and fell into step beside him, and they walked down the hallway together, and Simone watched them go. She wrote up her notes that afternoon, careful and complete the way Adelaide had taught her, the way she would want someone to write notes if it were her. She documented the service dog situation, not as a complaint but as a case study. She sent it to Dr. Olak and asked if he thought it was worth bringing to the clinical committee, whether there might be value in reviewing the hospital's service animal protocol to ensure it was consistent with federal guidelines and with actual clinical evidence. Black wrote back within an hour, already thinking the same thing. "Let's set up a meeting." 6 weeks later, the protocol was revised. The new version included a provision for emergency same-day verification using the National Registry and a clause requiring clinical consultation before any service animal could be removed from a patient with a documented psychiatric condition. It was 3 paragraphs. It had taken an hour to draft and 6 weeks of meetings to approve, which was how institutional change always worked, slowly, with a great deal of paper, and usually because someone had been willing to sit in a chair and wait long enough that the silence finally had to become something. One heard, through Bolak, that Thibodeau was doing better. Not well. That wasn't the right word, and she'd never used it, not with patients who were working this hard, because it set an expectation that healing was a destination and not a direction. He was doing better. He'd made contact with a veterans peer support group in Gatineau. He was seeing a therapist who specialized in operational stress injuries. His daughter was calling every Sunday. Brûlot, as far as anyone knew, was still doing his job. Simone went back to the floor the next morning, and the morning after that. She made coffee in the break room and read the overnight notes and knocked on open doors. She sat in the chair in the corner when someone needed her to. She held her hand out, palm up, and let the silence be what it was. It was not a dramatic life. It didn't look like much from the outside, but she had learned in 6 years on the 4th floor that the things that kept people alive were rarely dramatic. They were quiet. They were specific. They were a bowl of water and an hour of not asking questions and one person willing to stay in the room until the room felt safe. Was the job. And she was very good at it. Blonde, I keep thinking about the chair. Paperwork, not the committee meeting, not the moment Faulkner finally went quiet. Just the chair, pulling it from the corner of that room and sitting down and not saying anything for 4 minutes. That was the whole thing, really. That was where it started. I've been a nurse long enough to know that people, patients, families, administrators are often waiting for you to prove something the moment you walk in. That you're competent, that you're efficient, that you have a plan. And I understand that. I do. But there are situations where the most honest thing you can do is admit that you don't yet know what's needed. And so you sit down and you wait and you let the other person lead. What I saw in Thibodeau wasn't stubbornness. It wasn't aggression. It was someone who had been processed so many times by the military, by the medical system, by well-meaning people with clipboards that he had stopped expecting anyone to actually look at him. He had learned to make himself very small inside all that silence, and he had one thing left that he trusted completely, and that was his dog. Rational. That's cause and effect. When every system that was supposed to hold you has failed you, you hold on to what hasn't failed you yet. Brûlot hadn't failed him, so Thibodeau held on. I think about that when people ask me why I didn't just follow protocol from the start. And the honest answer is, I did follow protocol. I verified the registration. I documented everything. I consulted with psychiatry. The protocol, done properly, supported keeping the dog. What I refused to do was let an incomplete internal form override clinical reality. And that refusal wasn't rebellion. It was just clear thinking. It was understanding that rules exist to protect people. And when a rule is being applied in a way that harms the very person it's supposed to protect, someone has to say so out loud. It takes something. I don't say that to flatter myself. I mean, it costs something to be the one who says so. You risk being wrong. You risk being seen as difficult. You risk your professional relationships with people you have to work alongside for years. I sat in that committee room knowing all of that, and I said it anyway, because I had watched a man come back from the edge of something terrible, and I was not going to let a 4-page form undo that. Lucy told me her father said, I was the first person in 2 years who didn't make him feel like a problem. I've thought about that almost every day since, because I didn't do anything extraordinary. I sat down. I waited. I learned his name before I learned his diagnosis. I asked permission before I reached toward his dog. These are small things. They are the smallest possible things, and somehow they were enough to begin. That's what I want to remember about this. Not the policy change, not the meeting, not any of the parts that felt like a fight. I want to remember that the beginning of everything was just choosing to be still, to not fill the silence, to trust that if I stayed present long enough, something true would eventually happen in the space between us. Otto did the hard work. I just made sure the room was safe enough for him to do it. That's the job. And on the days when it feels like too little, on the days when the paperwork is endless and the system is slow and I'm tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix, I come back to that. One chair, one room, one person who needed someone to stay. It's always enough to start there.